Hey guys, it's Sergio. Today I'm going to be reviewing Americandirt by Jeanine Cummins. Right off the top, I'm going to let you guys know that this is going to be filled with spoilers, so if you don't want any spoilers, go ahead and click out of this video. And one thing I want to get out of the way is that my problems with this book isn't skin deep. It's not that a white person wrote about Mexico or Mexicans. One of my favorite books I've ever read is called When I Wear My Alligator Boots, and it's by a Canadian woman. So it has nothing to do with Jeanine Cummins' skin color, and has everything to do with her turning border stories into these freak shows. So let me just jump right into it. Almost everything about this book is a giant mess. When I was reading it, I found myself bored. When I was finished with it, I sat there wondering why it was such a slog to get through, why the book felt so formulaic and so soulless. And then it hit me that this book has no soul because the author doesn't understand the story she set out to write. It was probably the most pretentious, presumptuous, and overly ambitious piece of fiction I have ever read in my life. So the story follows Lydia Perez and her son Luca's journey as they try to escape into the U.S. After her husband exposes the crimes of a cartel kingpin, the kingpin's hitmen gun down their family, but Lydia and her son manage to get away from that massacre. The journey begins in Acapulco and ends in the U.S. Excuse me, ends in the U.S. According to the book, they travel over 200,000 miles, but the way Mexico is written in this book, you would think it was a tiny island surrounded by cartel henchmen and infested with crime. Even when Lydia and her son Luca are hundreds of miles and states away from Acapulco, they're still worried that the people around them might be spies from the cartel or ready to sell them out. It's true that the cartels in Mexico are very powerful and they're very prominent there, but they still operate within the confinements of the underworld. There's an entire greater society in Mexico that isn't entangled with crimes and people who live ordinary, everyday lives. It was absolutely asinine that they were that worried about the cartels, about that specific cartel. And guys, look, I understand this is fiction and creative liberties are taken to tell a better narrative. Fine, I'll grant Jeanine Cummins that. I'll grant her this fictionalized crime-ridden Mexico where even the mother sweeping her front porch might sell you out to the cartels. Okay, let's go with that. But then why are Lydia and Luca trusting every other person they meet on their way to the U.S. If everyone is willing to sell you out to the cartels, why are they so trusting? They meet two sisters from Honduras, so outside of being beautiful, we're not really given any reason to believe they're trustworthy. Likewise, they meet a guy with a machete and a little kid named Beto who has wads of money in his pocket. He just shows up with a bunch of money in his pockets. In this crime-infested Mexico that Jeanine Cummins created, wouldn't a weapon and loads of cash from a little child be red flags? Wouldn't that be a red flag? Why would you trust someone that easily? Nothing in the book was cohesive. The characters are flat, and they don't really have much depth. How they show up is how they act for the remainder of their time in the story. A creepy guy with a tattoo, he's always creepy. A funny kid, he's always funny. A young girl who's a victim, yeah, she's always a victim. Throughout the whole book, she's a victim. The author tried to give these background stories when she would introduce them, but these background stories didn't do anything for the characters. They didn't drive the main story forward, nor crafted the characters' personalities. They were just kind of there, loosely attached to these characters with as much passion as a college student's notes, because the author has no idea how to write these characters. Either she doesn't know people like the characters she tried to portray, or she is just an awful writer. I don't know. I've never read any of her work, and I don't intend to read any of her work after this. The bulk of the story can be summed up with the very formulaic storytelling of characters get on top of a train, the train stops, characters get off train, walk around, meet characters get back on top of train heading to the U.S., repeat. It's that for over 200 pages. It's just reading that over and over. And again, characters pop up with these anecdotes that just kind of seem to be attached to the page without any really passion or any real reason. Um, and at the core, the narrative is not a border story. Jeanine Cummins was out of her depth trying to write one, and you can see it in the main elements that drive the story. So let's start with Lydia, who is a bookshop owner in Acapulco. Acapulco is a busy, thriving city. So we have to assume a businesswoman in that place would be at least middle class. We're also told she had a trust fund of some sorts from her in-laws, and she and her husband had a good amount of money squirreled away. So already we have a character with advantages that most people crossing the border don't have. People crossing the border are generally poor and seeking better lives. So already any attempt that Jeanine Cummins tried to make this a relatable story for the Hispanic community is completely wiped away when she introduces that money aspect and that element. Considering that most border stories are with people with nothing but hope, and trying to make their lives better for them and their families. So instead of a story about hope, when she introduced the money, we get a story that's about trying to make it to the U.S. before her money runs out. And money comes up a lot throughout the story. Forget the fact that Mexicans don't use the word carajo, which I believe is a Puerto Rican slang word, and that barbecue sauce isn't eaten in Mexico. But for some reason, this was a big factor in the opening scene. If there's any aspect of the story I need to point to show the inauthenticity and how ignorant the narrative is, it would be that money is such a huge factor in this border crossing story. I don't think Jeanine Cummins could have written the story without money as an element, as it's consistently used for moments of drama and even a lazy deus ex machina in the final act where a 10-year-old kid pays a coyote for our main characters to make it across the border. Even the dramatic scenes are rendered ineffectual because Jeanine Cummins doesn't know how to write the story. After Lydia's 16 family members are gunned down on her front yard, any emotional drama we might be expecting after such a traumatic event is completely wiped out. And instead we get paragraphs of her doing mundane things like going to the convenience store and purchasing a bus ticket. There's entire paragraphs that look as inspired as like reading out a Target receipt. Americandirt, it's really a book that's a feeble attempt of someone outside the culture trying to write a border story. It has flat, boring, impassionate characters with the storyline that is formulaic because the author tries to tell a story she doesn't understand in a world she knows nothing about, filled with characters she either doesn't have the writing prowess to create or the intimacy with real-life counterparts to relate to. So they just come off like these forced versions of people that I know. There's no consistency in the book. Mexico was a crime-infested place where even a child might sell you out to the cartels when it needed to be. And then in other scenes, we have a bank teller violating all sorts of regulations to help Jeanine Cummins. Lydia Perez get money to cross the border. Characters were ignorant and didn't know anything if the narrative needed it. Like when Luca wasn't aware of northern Mexican slang like güey, so the other child had to explain it to him. Yeah, in other scenes we see Luca rattling off all this U.S. city trivia the characters were very inconsistent. She obviously didn't know how to craft any of these characters, had no idea how border stories mold Hispanic people's personalities and fears and all that. They were just kind of just thrown together into this mess of a story. But the worst part of reading this book was that the whole time I was imagining people I know and love and whose stories I've heard myself, except that it was these perverted, fetishized versions of them, and that the author was making them perform in my head like a bunch of circus freaks. And I'll end with this. If you're choosing to ignore the controversy behind this book and just enjoy it, you're choosing to ignore the voice of the Hispanic community. There's no way around that. I tried going into this book thinking I'm going to ignore all the cultural misrepresentation and all that, but you just can't. You can't separate the ignorance from the narrative, because at the heart of the narrative is that ignorance, and it's driving the story. The ignorance is what drives the story, and what makes this such a poorly written, such a slog to get through. This was easily it's billed as a thriller, but it's easily one of the worst books I've ever read. It's slow moving, it's boring, it's flat, and it's fueled by ignorance. The heart of this book is ignorance, so you can't separate the controversy and the lack of cultural understanding from the narrative and just enjoy it. It's impossible. I mean, that's all I've got to say about this book. I could have gone into it a little bit. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching, guys. Let me know what you think.